Hello friends, welcome back to TMYS Academy. Today I am with John Stratton Hawley, informally Jack Hawley. He is Clare Taub Professor of Religion at Barnard College, Columbia University. His most recent books on India's Bhakti traditions are A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of Bhakti Movement, published by Harvard University Press in 2015, Source Ocean with Kenneth Bryant, Harvard University Press 2015, a poem commentary called Into Sur's Version, Harvard Oriental Series 2016, and Krishna's Playground, Vrindavan in the 21st Century, Oxford 2020. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fulbright Fellow and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So today we are about to explore Jack Hawley as the Bhakta and his work in the Bhakti series. Welcome to the show, Professor Hawley.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Absolutely, it's our honor. So, Professor Hawley, I'll start with my first question to you. And I'll begin this session by asking about the perceived or contextual difference between the words religious and spiritual. The question comes to my mind because the word religious has become very political in today's context compared to spiritual, which seems rather pure and peaceful. Do you think there is any concrete evidence in the texts behind shaping of such perceptions, or it is just the corrupt sensationalization of the times?
I don't know about sensationalization, but I'd love to hear what you mean when you say that the terms religion and spirituality in an Indian context have come to have different designations. What's the background from India as you see it?
From India, what I feel is that the moment you use the word religion, a lot of things, a lot of perceptions change. A lot of people immediately try to put you in a category that religion, which religion? So if you say that I conform to Hinduism, immediately you are a hater of the rest of the religion and vice versa. So there is a lot of assumptions related to the word religion compared to the word spirituality, which is more about people who are into tapasya or people who are into seeking something very beautiful, very spiritual, very peaceful, very calming.
So there's good religion and there's bad religion. And the good religion is what you're calling spirituality, and the bad religion is what you're calling religion. I guess people do think in those. Sometimes you get in American speech the phrase organized religion. So that's what means religion. And the term spirituality came into American usage, to my understanding, in the course of the 19th century. And it really designated not just personal religion, that was still part of the overall vocabulary of religion, but a specific kind of religion that had to do with seances and questioning of Christianity as a rubric, and the building of alternate structures and communities that really, and by the way, very much associated with the domain of women. So that's not, to my perception anyway, though most people perhaps are not aware of that background. I'm not sure that I know it very well myself. But then it became a sort of trope in, I would say 50 years ago, 40 years ago. People would say, oh, I'm spiritual, but not religious. So, okay, there we are. It somehow has become a cultural thing. But now I'm speaking from an American point of view. I'm interested in what you had to say about the Indian expression of this. So the kind of description of religion that you gave sounds as if it verges into the communal or communalism. And by the way, the very use of that ending ism, I think, is quite significant, because the term Hinduism is an English term, of course. Mm-hmm. And I think you could argue that it carries with it the baggage that's associated with the term religion by contrast to, let us say, dharma or bhakti or Gom, something like that, Pant, Sampradaya. There are a whole range of terms that could be used. The sense of an ism having a sort of real world baggage is a real thing. And of course, with the partitioning of the subcontinent, we see how that ismization of religion has had real and terrible political consequences. So I appreciate the fact that you're sort of trying to move in the direction of something that would seem to be a little bit different from the rubric religion. But in the modern Indian context, doesn't the term bhakta also come to have a specifically political connotation? You know, there are the bhaktas and the secularists. Well, there we are very much in a political domain, in a public domain, that is at least as charged as what you just said about the domain of religion.
True that. So, what are your thoughts about the meaning and significance of religion in the social, emotional, and academic context today? Because you are a professor of religion, and what does it mean to you to be a professor of religion in the academic context or maybe in the social context?
So first of all, you must be thinking that I'm sort of some kind of asura because you, well, really, isn't it clear? Because you don't actually have the discipline of religious studies in India. And then you could say, well, why is that? And of course, it has to do with actually the legacy of the British and that whole questioning of whether British colonial power in Britain would be tied with Christian religion or not. So then once again, we're in a very kind of charged domain. In the United States, in the 1960s, there, well, let's go back to before the 60s. Strange that we're talking about American history here. Before the 60s, largely speaking, there would be departments of religion in, say, an American college, such as the one that I went to, Amherst College, or, yeah. And of course, there's a long history of education being tied to the church, which is not the case for Amherst, but still you had a religion department. But it was largely speaking, people who would teach about theology from a Christian point of view, usually with a token Jew. That before the 60s. And then there came an important court case which had to do with whether it was legitimate to teach religion in an institution where people came out of the general public. And in response to that court case, you could say, but there was also a cultural revolution that happened at the same time. You had a specific attempt to broaden the term, what would be meant by the term religion, so that it would not just represent certainly theological or doctrinal thinking, but would represent sociological, anthropological, psychological ruminations on just what it is that we do when we do something that we think of as religion. That was one side, toward the social sciences and literature. And the other side had to do with a really fundamental thing, which was to place Christianity and Judaism in their cultural context and see that they're a significant part, but they're only a part of the global landscape of religion. So it was at that point that we began to have Hinduism, to take the example that's on the table already, taught as part of the normal curriculum for the study of religion in the United States. That process has not happened in India. Religion is still apparently regarded as too dangerous to be touched in an academic domain. Some of us feel that its danger increases if it's not touched in an academic domain. If people don't have a chance to think about the very terms and sort of phenomena that you and I have so far been talking about in the same kind of disciplined, open way that we would expect if someone were taking a course on history or sociology.
Sure. So how does literature and philosophy in religious texts and verses impact human minds? How does the research that analyzes and interprets and questions the traditional faith seek to make a difference?
Well, I think that takes off from what we were just talking about. If we think of religion as a realm of practice or mind that in its own terms is not accessible to thinking that comes from other parts of our mind, then we're in a very strange situation, it seems to me. It seems to me that indeed religion has no place in any curriculum at all. And you could ask, well, what's its place in life? But people aren't like that. People don't live their lives in boxes. One part of the mind asks questions of other parts of the mind. Something that happens to you First thing in the morning, the saying of the Gayatri Mantra actually has something to do with what goes on in the rest of the day, and is intended to do so. So why should we maintain this kind of bifurcation? In my own past, I think you could say that I grew up in a religious household, a Christian household, and was always very struck by the difference between Sunday and every other day of the week. So we know that that difference is sanctioned in the biblical traditions, but it's a very strange thing. You know, you behave in one way on Sunday, you talk in a certain way on Sunday, you engage with a certain realm of experience, thinking, philosophy used the word, on Sunday. And then on Monday morning, you go back to the world, which is as it is. And we sort of know that it is as it is. Oh, you can try to make the connection. But the basic understanding is that Sunday is Sunday and the rest of the week is the rest of the week. I found that very unsettling. I live in a world like that. So I think what I did over the long term was to try to find a place personally where I could bridge that distance between what we've just been calling the real world and that other world, which is no less real, that happened in my experience on a Sunday. So I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question, but it says something maybe about how it was that I've gotten into the strange place that I find myself in today.
No, it does, you know, because the primary reason why I asked you the question is that are we open to, or are we allowed to question when it comes to religious contexting of any habit, any ritual? And you have just answered that.
But look at the, take the Vedic tradition. The word samvad is shot through that tradition. Of course, there are matters of authority. We were just talking about the Ahilya story, or Ahilya, as it sometimes is pronounced. That's a story that's full of confrontations, and those confrontations are actually built into the scriptural record that comes being a Hindu. Similarly, on the biblical side, Abraham he's arguing with God. We have stories of how Abraham is having an argument with God. So the business of contesting religiosity is, I think, is part of religiosity. And for us to pretend that it's not so is to only, scratch the surface of what's actually involved there.
Assume control over it, probably, by a few strong-headed ones, the keepers of religion.
Okay, strong-headed ones. So now, how about the Ramayana? We were talking about Ahilya. The Ramayana, good enough. So we have the Tulsi Ramayana that Ramcharitmanas performed all over India today, from Bombay all the way across to Calcutta and many places in between, and also the Ram Lila. But, so we have Kathavachaks who expound the Ramayana, but is it expected that people who sit in the audiences for such a katha will have questions about why Rama has behaved as he has behaved? You yourself are now writing a book about this question. That comes actually from inside the Ramayana tradition. So yeah, it's the Kathavachak's job to justify what's there in the text, but it's the hearer's job to ask questions about it. And it's in that samvad that we have a sense of entering into the religious life that actually matters.
True.
Not just something that you can, some pandal that you can place in your own personal realm, and that's that. It's not like that. The pandal is going to come down in the weather, and you have to figure out, okay, what is the appropriate cover? And should there be a cover at all?
Coming to your books, Professor, your book, A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of Bhakti Movement, clarifies the historical and political contingencies that give birth to the concept of the Bhakti Movement. As per your research, how did the music and poem, the literature and philosophy, manage to make an inway to establish a fine new community altogether, defying all political captivism that religion could have enforced, something that we had just been discussing? The question comes right from there.
It does indeed. The purpose of that book, in any case, was to try to take the idea of the Bhakti movement, which is, this beautiful, and by the way, it's a samvad idea.
Yeah.
It's the Bhakti movement is, in many ways, an instantiation of the kind of back and forth talking that we've been and asking questions that we've been talking about. Not just because a question that is articulated in a particular poem in one language will then appear in another language, but also because the various great bhaktas of India stand for different things, and they're brought into conversation with each other. Periyalvar, for example, in the south, in relation to Andal. Or Mirabai, who's busy, we are told, in a correspondence with Tulsidas when she doesn't know what to do in her life. So, you know, this idea of conversation is built into the idea of the Bhakti movement. And of course, it's a conversation between centuries and between parts of the country. It's a beautiful idea, and it's an idea that has openness as a part of it to start with. I mean, just think of a person like Kabir or Raidas as part of this conversation, raising questions about the religiosity of others who were in the conversation, like Tulsidas, who, by the way, doesn't like Kabir and all he stands for very much. But there it is, as part of what we are calling a single thing. The purpose of this book was not to demean any of that or to devalue it, quite to the contrary, but to try to show that we ourselves, historically speaking, are a part of that conversation. That the idea of the Bhakti movement is not some sempiternal thing, some just thing that is there, but is an idea that has emerged in the course of time in relation to political formations, cultural formations, and as a matter of fact, that has its origin in a particular part of India and not elsewhere. It turns out, I hope to have shown, that the idea of the Bhakti movement is basically a northern idea about the South. You could speak of it as a way of the North's appropriating the South, puts it rather strongly. Certainly it has very strong associations with the genesis of the nation of India too. I believe that the most important formulation of the idea of the Bhakti movement was in fact, it happened in Hindi, not in English, though in conversation with English, on the part of Hazare Prasad Dwivedi, that great scholar of Hindi literature, who was the first person actually, as he translated George Grierson over into Hindi, Grierson became someone different. It became then Bhakti Ka Andolan in his, and when he said Andolan, he meant the kind of Andolan that was, you know, in the Gandhian vocabulary and elsewhere. So this was a way of interpreting the past that made sense to the present and made sense to the creation of the nation of India. I think it's not accidental that Indira Gandhi, when she was the Minister of Information and Broadcasting, turned to the great Sanskrit scholar V. Raghavan, who came, of course, from the far south of India, and asked him to give a set of lectures, which was essentially on the Bhakti movement. It was called the Great Integrators. So the idea there was that you had built into the sort of intellectual and emotional soil of India the properties that would make it possible for the nation to become a single nation in cultural, literary, religious, feeling terms. So to think that the Bhakti movement, you know, that is just there in history is really a mistake. There certainly are moments of expressiveness in all the Indian languages that we know that created the possibility for the idea of the Bhakti movement. But that idea actually began to be articulated, I think, at the end of the 16th century in North India, in a text that we haven't talked about yet. And then again, powerfully in the 18th, and then when we get to the 20th century, it becomes the Bhakti movement, so to speak. So just as the grammar of the Hindi language, whatever its pre-existing state might have been, is codified in the first decades of the 20th century, so similarly, the Bhakti movement is codified as an idea at just that point in time. And it's not accidental that it happens in Hindi, because Hindi itself is looking for a past. It's looking for a past that will be all Indian rather than just Brajbhasha, let us say, or Awadhi. So it's a complicated and I think very interesting story. And it ends up being a story that involves us, not just the great Bhakta bhaktas of history, but those of us who are thinking about the past that interests us, if we're interested in India, or if we are ourselves India. What do we make of this heritage? And what do we make of the fact that we ourselves, at an earlier point in time, were the makers of this heritage?
So, Professor, you have a commendable body of work on Surdas. And the book description of Surdas, poet, singer, saint, it reads, I mean, if you allow, I'll just read a little bit of the description. For decades, Surdas has been Jack Hawley's ideal poet, but not the Surdas we all think we know. The poet of Krishna's childhood, the discipline of Vallabhacharya. Rather, Hawley focuses on a Surdas who emerges from the early manuscripts where the poems were first collected. They reveal quite another Sur, a poet of extraordinary range, a man who never abandoned his sense of personal struggle, a saint devoted to singing. Was this Surdas blind? Probably not. I'm sure you had begun by consuming the original texts on Surdas, being fed on the popular belief and evidence. As you went ahead with your research, exploring a very different personality, how did you negotiate the conflict in your own brain? I mean, how challenging is it for an author to rediscover the popular ideals from religious and cultural history?
Okay, well, thanks for reading that out. I hope you can see already that from what we were just talking about, the idea of the Bhakti movement, the way in which I personally might find myself drawn into such a set of questions. I'm not as good at history as I wish I were, but there's something in my formation that makes me want to ask, well, how did we get here? What is the evidence? How do we know what we know? And it's not just that that horrible man is sitting in the White House, you know, busy saying that anything factual is actually counterfactual. It's just fake because he wants it to be fake. We can't live in a world like that. We really want to know what is the basis of things, what is true. And, you know, that doesn't mean that there's only one place we can turn to get there, but there are. The past is not unknown to us, thank goodness. The past is a great gift. It enables us to see the present with a sense of nuance and self-questioning that we wouldn't perhaps otherwise be able to pull forward or even rely upon. So back to the question of Surdas. The stories of Surdas all take us to the 16th century. That's the period in which he is said to have thrived. That's the period in which he became a pupil of Vallabhacharya, as we read in the Chaurasi Vaishnavan Ki Varta. That's the Surdas whom we know. That's the time in which he was blind. What are our sources for that? Okay, let's ask. Well, we can move in two ways. First of all, we can look at the poetry itself and the music. Which of those songs actually can be shown to have emerged from the 16th century? And that gets us to the question of manuscripts. We have manuscripts for Surdas. It's a great and precious heritage. And by the way, if I can get on the pulpit here, India has the most remarkable collection of manuscripts, you could argue, of any country in the world. Many of those manuscripts are in danger. The government has undertaken projects to try to save and protect and make known those manuscripts. It's a very important work. So in the case of Surdas, it turns out that there is a manuscript which bears the date 1582, to translate it over into the Gregorian calendar that we're speaking of today, 1582, which already contains, it's a manuscript in 3 parts, and those 3 parts all have something to do with Sur. So it's a manuscript that is already a collection of 3 earlier manuscripts. That takes us right into well, at the very latest, let us say the 1560s or so, right there in the 16th century. So we can look at those, and by the way, this was a manuscript that was written in Fatehpur. This is in Shekhawati. and that makes reference actually to its position in the time of Akbar. Akbar is not incidental to this whole project, by the way. The sort of building of Vrindavan also happened at this time, and it happened because of a relationship of concordat between the Mughal state and the Kachwahas, that's to say, Raja Man Singh of, today we would say Jaipur, but Amer, as it would have been called then, or Amber. So we actually have materials from the 16th century that will show us what poems of Sur were circulating then. And it's not Maya Mohi Makan Naikayo. That doesn't exist. That song that we all cherish turns out not to show up until, so far as I know, the 19th century. So it became a part of the Sur tradition, but it probably is not a part of the original Sur tradition. So that's the kind of process that went into trying to learn who Surdas actually was. I believe that there was a great poet who called himself Surdas, who stands at the fount of the Surdas tradition. But that doesn't mean that every poem that we sing in the name of Surdas was written by that person. Rather, it's that he was such a great poet that he attracted toward himself a sense of adulation and appreciation on the part of many people, so that if you were to perform, to think of, so to speak, or to be visited by a poem which is about, let's say, the Lord Krishna, when you come to the point of adding your oral signature to that poem, your chap, your mudra, why would you use your own name? I'm not going to use the name Jack. I would use the name Sur. It's not my poem, it's Surdas's poem. That's, I think, what happened to the tradition. So the project here is to try to get back to those early poems, and those are the ones that Ken Bryant and I, working with the incredibly helpful aid of the computer, we never could have done this on our own. We went back to the dated manuscripts, which give us access to the 16th century, actually, the century when Sur appeared. And we've tried to present in the Murthy Classical Library of India only those poems which can be shown to go back to the 16th century. It's not that there are just a few of them, there are more than 400, but that's a far cry from the 5,000 that you would find in the now canonical Nagari Pracharana Sabha edition of Surdas. So if you're interested, it's available at low cost all over India. The Murthy Classical Library of India 5 gives you a translation on one side of the page, and then our attempt to, really Ken Bryant's attempt to reconstruct the original on the other side, and he tells you in the notes how he's gone about doing that. So it's that kind of work that has grabbed me, and what I'm into recently, I don't know whether I dare show you this, can I try to divide the screen, is taking a look at what happens when we see how Surdas looked at the earliest point in time. And it turns out, just as in the case of what we're talking about with the poems, that the Sur we think we know is not the Sur who they thought they knew in the earliest moment when we begin to have images of him. Do you have time to see him for a minute?
Yes, please go ahead. I was waiting for you.
All right, well, let me try to divide the screen. Those of you who have used Zoom technology know that there's plenty of room for error here. Okay, yes. Here's Surdas everybody knows and loves. You see him singing to the Child Krishna. You see him with his Ektad. You see that he's very old, and you certainly see that he's blind. Where did this picture come from? Straight off the internet, Wikipedia initially, so it must be true. It came from a poster that was put together by Brijbasi and Sons when they were in Mathura and Mumbai, probably in the early 1940s. As you'll see, Wikipedia got it just backwards. There he is, in this earlier form, but still it's the same idea that the child Krishna is listening to Sur. In the early poems we were just talking about, the 16th century poems, the childhood poems are there and they're gorgeous, but they're part of a much larger corpus that includes, for example, the Ramayana, and very much the Virha poems and the Brahma Gita and so forth. That's where the center of the tradition was in the 16th century, not in the childhood. Here's the Murti edition that we've been talking about. And what Ken Bryant and I tried to do was to go up the Yamuna of the Surdas tradition as far as we could go. This is Saptarishi Kund at the head of the Yamuna. So if we think of Sur's ocean, Sur Sagar is not an ocean, but a great river, which has developed over time. And we tried to go up as far down, up that river as we could. And when we come to the matter of where our images of Sur appear, it's in Udaipur. This is not an Udaipuri image, but it's the first dated image of Sur. There he is at the bottom, performing, as you can see, not just for Krishna and Radha, but for those who would be gathered in the Nawabad court of Lucknow in 1817. Please note the Hindu-Muslim dimensions of this. This is the earliest dated visual manuscript of, and amusingly, I think you'll see that he's actually, though he's blind, he's reading from a book to those who are listening to him down at the bottom. So it's a wonderful conception of what a book can be for a blind poet. But it turns out that poems to Sur were first illustrated at the court of Mewar in Udaipur in the latter half of the 17th century. Here's one and here's another. They're both holy poems, basically. And it's at that point that we have our first image of the poet. You see him here. We'll come in just a minute. But here's the context in which it takes place. So this is a poem that's being illustrated. It's a poem that goes back to those very 16th century manuscripts that we were talking about, which was at least shared in the 16th century. It's attested in some, I think, 8 of 13 manuscripts from places ranging from Udaipur itself far, far to the east. And it begins in this way. Hasikani sikarani chaditer sunayo, birhani savadha kerahiyo, liye pavas dala ayo. So you get a sense of it, and then Badra ati banaye the pavanatazi, that's a crucial word. Chadichatak dekhayo. So I won't read the whole poem, but you get a sense of what's going on here.
Yes.
Right in the center of the poem, we have love. It's the monsoon season, so we're going to come into that very soon. It's the monsoon season when the woman who is separated from her lover, in this case Krishna, feels the terrible pangs of what that separation is. And by the way, he's feeling it himself, but we don't see so much of that. And indeed, the love god, Mohan, as he's called in the poem, Madan, I forget, appears in the tree right in the middle. But it's the birds, it's the peacocks, Sikani Sikarani, who have climbed to the top of the peak there, and they're calling out to the girl, you know, the dangers of the rainy season. And the artist here has depicted this in the most incredible way. The clouds are described as if they were horses, actually. The word that's used is tazi. So that's an Arabic word, very unusual for Sur. But he picks up that sense of Arabic horses fighting with one another and keeps that in a sort of metaphorical domain, which is clearly marked out. And then we return to the Pur Virani. And at the end of the poem, Surdas announces his signature. How does it go at the end? It says, Surdas Samrit Kebane, Samrit Vevane, Pranajata Brahmayo. So Brahmayo, everything slows to a stop. She can't breathe anymore. So that's very appropriate for the last word of the poem. You're not breathing anymore. The poem is at an end. It's a gorgeous poem of Sur. And then we see that the poet himself is represented by the artist just where he ought to be if we were listening to the poem itself. We're reading from top to bottom and from left to right. So as we follow that process, we arrive at the poet. And what does the poet look like? Take a look at him. Does he look like the Sur we've just been seeing in Wikipedia? No. First of all, he has no musical instrument here. He seems to be in contemplation. And his arm is rested on a yogi's stick. And the only jewels that he has are, of course, his tulsi beads. They're everywhere. And what is that cap? Who wears a cap like that? I don't know the answer. I want cap experts to see this. But what's most astonishing about this representation of the poet, I think, he certainly is blind, and he has a little bit of a shadow beard. He can't seem to get to the barber often enough, and you know his servant doesn't come every day to get him to the barber, so he's shown with a little bit of a beard. What does that signify? Is it a Muslim marking in some way? Is that what a Sant Kavi is? Someone whose domain transfers itself over into a Muslim realm too? It's a question. But the astonishing thing to me is that he seems to be in Saki Bhav here. He is in the position of the Virani, who is just above. He also is being affected by the words which he has produced or heard. And I say he's in Saki Bhav because I think we see him wearing, in fact, a bodice. Strikingly different from any other image of Sur that emerges at that early point in time, but important for its individuality, I would say. And let me just scroll down a little bit. I thought maybe Ahilya was hiding there. No, here is Ahilya. Do you see that Kevat here is standing in the middle of the Ganga and pointing to this stone?
Right.
And here's Ahilya. What he doesn't want to happen to his boat is what happened to this stone. When Ahilya emerged from it, he's worried about what's going to happen to his family if he takes Rama and Lakshmana on board to get to the other side of the Ganga, but something happens to his boat and suddenly he's without a livelihood. So there's your Ahilya for the day. All comes from poetry, Surdas. Just take you down to the end and get at least some vision of how he is apt to look in a more normal painting from this period. He is a musician, but it's not the Ektar. And he doesn't look that old, does he? He's not this ancient guy singing to the child Krishna. He is to the child Krishna. Actually, there's the child right in the middle of the painting, but he's singing as a musician. He has his mayas, and he's involved in his song. So it's a very different Surdas from the Sur we have been taught to expect. The excitement of doing historical research is to be able to recover those other dimensions that have been lost in present history. It's not that present history is bad, it's just that it's not the only thing. If we study the past, there's something to be learned, both from the point of view of sort of, well, what happened, in this case, what happened in visual artistry, but also, and what happened in the history of a poetic tradition. But it's also to be able to religiously or emotionally to enter into a world that we're unaccustomed to associating with the very poet who took us there. So that's why I do what I do. I don't know. So we go back to real time here.
Yeah.
Hello.
Professor, thank you so much for such a illustrious, description of your research. I really, when you were showing, I was totally absorbed in it. And I really hope that someday I get to sneak into your class and just listen to your lecture. Probably. Whether that would happen or not.
Thank you for letting me sneak into your class instead.
I so much loved that description, the way you explained, the photographic evidence, the illustrations. I mean, I really had a great time for the last 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. You've been a Saturday for sure.
Getting to your next book. So, your latest book, Krishna's Playground, Vrindavan in the 21st Century. When you came to visit Vrindavan for the first time, what had you expected the place to be like, and how was it different? Can the place called Vrindavan that you may have envisioned before coming to India be attributed to your love for Bhakti music or Surdas songs? How has your book negotiated between that expectation of a lover? And when I say lover here, I mean you.
Well, okay, let me try to be brief. Here's the book that we're talking about.
Yes.
Krishna's Playground. And so we have been in the past. First, we were in the 16th century with the Murti edition, who was that Surdas? And then we were seeing how he first came to be depicted in art, which, by the way, is very unusual. We have a couple pictures of Tulsidas, but there was a moment where Surdas became a kind of virus, but a good virus, in Udaipur. And that was at the beginning up through the latter part of the 17th, early 18th century. And now we're talking about the 20th century when I first went to Vrindavan and how this book came to be, which is Vrindavan in the 21st century. So you're absolutely right that I went to Vrindavan with the hope of learning about Surdas. I mean, you know, this is Braj Bhasha, and it's in Vrindavan and in the Braj country where you have the greatest concentration of scholars who really know Surdas and where he is sung all the time. The Ras Leelas, there are a few Ras Leelas that are entirely built around songs by Sur. So I was doing a dissertation and, you know, it was a chance to enter into a world that I had only just vaguely heard about. My great patron, mentor, friend, scholarly advocate is Srivatsa Goswami, who belongs to one of the lineages that was established in Vrindavan in the 16th century, in Sur's century, and has been there ever since. So I owe everything to him and to all the people in Vrindavan of all kinds who have just talked with me over the years. When I went there, I went in part to try to learn to live in Braj Bhasha and to be able to speak Hindi, which by no means is one of my native languages. I learned it at the age of 30, and that's why it's so imperfect. I mean, I'm trying to excuse that, but you know, try starting to learn a language at 30. It's not the best. But it turned out when I got there that there was this whole other group of people who were also English speakers and had faces that looked a lot like mine, except many of them had shaved their heads and you could only see the jyoti on the back. And who were they? They were ISKCON devotees. Yeah. The great temple of Krishna Balaram was being built at that point in time in the 70s. When people would see me on the streets of Vrindavan, they would say, Hare Krishna, or they would say, you know, Hari Bol. And I would say, Nahin, Radhe Radhe, yahan par Radhe Radhe bolte hain. Nahin, Hari Bol. So, you know, they saw the face and they knew that I was a Hari Bol speaker. No, so I tried to keep myself in some kind of domain that felt more like the real Vrindavan to me. The lesson of this book is that over the course of 45 years, Vrindavan has changed so fundamentally that the ISKCON temple is now at the geographical center of Vrindavan. And you could ask yourself whether ISKCON has come to be at the spiritual center of Vrindavan too, and at the economic center of Vrindavan. There's an enormous real estate revolution going on in Vrindavan that arguably is changing the face of the place so that it's just unrecognizable to someone like me. Take the Parikrama Marg. When I went there in the 70s, it was all Braj Ki Raj. It was just the dust of Braj, and you went with your bare feet. If you do that today, and people still do it today, you are on an entirely paved structure. It's a thoroughfare. It's a kind of ring road for Vrindavan, and you do the parikrama at risk of your life. People still do it. But just think of the changes in the course of only 40 years. And in fact, 25 years, 20 years. There's the real estate revolution. There's the fact that the water in the Yamuna is no longer drinkable. And in fact, people will not even bathe in it anymore. Imagine coming to Vrindavan and not going to the Tirtha, not going to the Yamuna. What are we to make of this situation? So this book, Krishna's Playground, asks that question. And it's an appeal, I suppose, on the part of definitely an outsider who has come to love Braj Bhasha and Vrindavan and the Vrindavan ke rehne wale deeply. What can be done in the age where we find ourselves? And please don't think that this is some gringo, some American pointing a finger at India and saying, oh, look how polluted your life is. Where was the automobile invented? Where did the Industrial Revolution first take place? It was me and my family, so to speak, my nation, that visited the automobile on the world. So we're in this climate crisis together. I have not been to Vrindavan since the descent of the COVID plague. I do know this, that the monkeys no longer can count on being fed by yatris. So they have retreated from Vrindavan, and that has meant that the peacocks can come back. And the quality of the water is better too, because industry has stopped upriver. It's not great, but it apparently has actually changed color. It's less black than blue now. So those are major changes, but look at the conditions under which they have happened. A stoppage of everything with this massive suffering and pain as people, had to leave Delhi behind and go to their own villages. I mean, it's just unimaginable. What world do we find ourselves in? I don't know the answer, but it seems to be quite some distance from the world that was envisioned by the Surdas we were just hearing and seeing, except that the condition of virha, being separated from the things that we have loved the most, that is our situation now. And we need somehow to gather strength and figure out how we can do something about it.
True. Thank you, Professor, for your time. I really had a great time listening to you. And, listening to you is about an American talking to an Indian about Indian culture, Indian religious beliefs, Indian spiritual and cultural beliefs. It's like reintroducing me to myself in a different way. So I had a great time. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for your invitation.
It's totally my pleasure.
Great from my side, and may everything be well with you. I'm thinking so much about COVID and its cost for India today. I'm very much looking forward to be back.
Absolutely. That is something I think the entire world is looking forward to it. And to our viewers, I know that this is COVID time. We are locked down. But one thing that I always say is that this is social isolation, not intellectual isolation. Keep reading, keep writing, keep thinking, and do read stories, do write stories. Thank you so much.